Howdy. I was just on my way to celebrate payday at the mines, and I passed some fellers on that old freight wagon down there a spell, and they said there was a group of people here in town wanting to know more about the history of those Bohemia mines. You know the ones I'm talking about. And I figured you might be those folks, so if you don't mind, I'll just sit down in this old bar stool and here in the Helena Saloon on Main Street, and I'll tell you all I know. Well, I guess the first big official notice of the mines came when this seven-book report was made back in 1900 by those fellers out in Washington, D.C. Now, they started that geology office in the 1870s because the whole country was wanting to know about those gold mines out here in the West. They was looking for some place to spend their investment money, and the government needed to know what mines were where. It seems that after 1848, when a fellow named Jim Marshall from Oregon was setting up a sawmill on Captain John Sutter's property in Coloma, California, and found gold in the water ditch he was digging, everyone in the country took off for California. Well, J.S. Diller was given the job of writing that book on Bohemia, and he did a mighty thorough job, too, I'll tell you. He walked all over those mountains, talked to the miners, and did some assay work on the different mines to see just how much gold was there. Now, that book was pretty popular, and it's my guess that one of those fellers who read it real careful was old Jonathan Bourne. Now, he was a lawyer from Massachusetts who made a good bit of money in gold mining over around Baker in eastern Oregon. Then he went to Portland and he became a fancy U.S. senator. Well, in 1902, I think it was, he sent a feller out to Bohemia to check out these mines in person. And this here map is part of that feller's report. You can see that wagon road at the bottom just winding its way up to the noonday mill. He even put in the telephone line that was coming up from Cottage Grove. That railroad they was surveying for never did quite get there. That place where the flag is, well, that's where that Forest Service lookout is today. And you folks can just drive right up there real easy. Takes you about 2 hours is all. This young feller also made a fancy map of all the claims in that part of the land. Yes, sir, that mining district sure was a busy place back around 1900, I figure. More than 2,000 claims had been filed by the time this here map was made. Now, this here mountain is Bohemia Mountain. You can look right past Bohemia and see Mount Shasta down there in California. Now, Mr. Diller says that these mountains right around Bohemia, called the Calapooya Range, are pretty interesting. They were built up from sheets of lava that came off those volcanoes further east. A little ground got pushed up later on, too, but most of these mountains were made from lava. There was a little bit of those icy glaciers on top of the mountains near Champion Creek, but the volcanoes did most of the work. If you look real hard at that grassy place in this picture, you can see the meadows around where the miners graze their horses. Those piles of sandy-looking stuff are the tailings from the music mine in Bohemia City, but I'll tell you about them later on. Diller says there was lots of happening at these mountains. Seems like they were the wall between the coast and the Cascade Mountains at the edge of that real old ocean that used to be all the way down to the Willamette Valley. He also said that the gold didn't get into these here mountains when they were formed from the lava. No, sir, this hot melted stuff from down in the earth sort of bubbled up inside the cool lava and filled in the spaces with the minerals that later got hard and stayed in the mountains as the ore with the gold, silver, lead, copper, and zinc that us miners found here later on. Now, this picture is of Grouse Mountain, where the Knott and Annie mines, the Noonday, the Helena, and Champion mines were. The old Knott Trail went over these hills. If you look over the opposite side of Fairview, you can see Grizzly Mountain. The old Noonday Trail would follow the ridge all the way over the mountain to the Noonday Mine. There's a place on that ridge called Dead Horse Hill, 'cause the climb was so hard on those poor critters. Guess old Horse Heaven Creek was named because they could finally rest when they got up to its headwaters. Well, that's enough talk about the mines for a bit. Now let's take a look at the town where those miners got their supplies and spent their money. Now this here is a picture of Cottage Grove from Mount David back in 1892. Wasn't much to it then, I suppose, but there was even less when gold was discovered in 1858 by fellers called Oglesby and Shields and Adams. Why, there wasn't even real town in the 1850s. People used the old Indian trails to get around. You see, there was two things that settled this country, and logging wasn't one of them. The first was the California gold rush back in 1849. Folks came west to mine, not to settle, but some smart people figured the miners would need supplies. So folks even as far north as the Willamette Valley were raising their own food and sending the extra on pack trains down into California. Well, miners started coming back from California when it just got too darn blamed crowded. They started remembering some rich-looking hills and old creek beds back home. So they came back to Oregon and brought their California gold and settled in to find their mines around these here parts. The other thing that settled this place was the land. The government's Donation Land Claim Act of 1850 let white residents get 320 acres for free if he or she lived on the land for 4 years. Some of our donation land claim people were Chapin and Shields and McFarland. Then there was Grisman and Mosby, Sears and Vaughn. Most of them worked in the mines a time or two themselves. The government also passed the Homestead Act in 1862 under President Lincoln that let people claim up to 160 acres of public land if they lived on it and approved it for 3 years. By 1885, the people were rushing to this here valley. Now this picture of the back of that brick store that is your Main Street shoe shop shows just how fancy the houses were getting. There was even a real estate office that dealt in mining properties. You see, in 1863, George Ramsey and Jim Johnson were leaving trouble behind in Roseburg and decided to hide out in the Calapooyas until things kind of quieted down. They followed the North Umpqua River up to City Creek near Bohemia Mountain. There they saw a shiny gold quartz. They came to these settlers to share the good news, and the rush was on. In 1864 and 1865, O.P. Adams, Squire Vaughn, and I think it was Bird Ferrier, find time to go prospecting. Now this here's a page in the Bohemia Nugget paper back in 1904. It shows just how many people were helped by business from the mines. The newspaper was owned at that time by a corporation of F.J. Hard, I believe it was. A Bohemia mining man from Colorado was a member. The Nugget only lasted 8 years against the other two papers in this busy town. Even though the railroad came through this town in 1872, the main way to the mines was by horses and freight wagons. There was more than one livery stable in town and a couple of freight lines that went to the mines and brought back the ore and concentrates from the mines. This stable belonged to Jim Potts and Alf Powell around 1906. It was on this spot where your Ben Franklin Bank is built. Now here's George McQueen, Jim Plaster, and Jim Potts, all waiting on the stage for their 3-day trip back to the mines. Some of the old freighters in the day were Robert Mosby, Joe Cole, Charlie, Carl, and Ben Pitcher, Rube Nelson, and don't forget Joe Damewood, who later on was a marshal here in Cottage Grove. Wes Crispin ran freighters and a stage line to the mines. He lived near the Row River and used his barns for freight stops. He ran the Fashion Stable in Cottage Grove and sent stagecoaches to Bohemia, also onto the Black Butte Mercury mines out London way. Freight rates cost between 1 and 2 cents a pound back in those days. Ed Patterson was one of his Bohemia drivers. Folks in these parts said that he was the best of the hee-haws who handled the ribbons. He'd leave town with the baggage and the mail and the passengers about 7 a.m., and he'd be at Red Bridge by 12 noon and the Ridge Hotel for the night. Those freight lines took everything up to the mines, even fancy wood-burning stoves and all the utensils. The mining people bought some things here at the Piper and Holderman store, the first hardware store in town. It was built back in 1891 at the corner of South River Road and Willamette Court. River Road, you know, used to be the main street of this town before the railroad came through on the east side of the river. Why, your new main street was just an old swampy wagon road with a covered bridge to the Row River people. It was so muddy, and some places were built on stilts because of the winter floods. People used boats in these streets in the flood season. In 1902, buildings were going up on the street between the river and the train tracks. So Mr. Charles Vandenberg, there on the left, and Sid Piper on the right, opened a fancier store to serve the town. The mines were booming and the population had gone from 800 to 3,000, all that in just a few years. You can see on this here store bill that the same store handled the blasting powder and miner supplies that went up to the Knowles and Getty's store at the music mine on Bohemia Mountain. Prices weren't too bad then. 3 claw hammers sold for $1.65. Miners needed some special stuff, you know. There was a big place in Portland, the Marshall Wells Hardware Company, I think it was called. They put out a big catalog of all kinds of supplies, and they could be sent by train. Can you imagine that? $13.50 for 12 shovels. Every miner needed to do some assay work to see if there was enough gold in the ore to pay the bills. And this store supplied a fancy set of mining scales for $3. Those mines were sure dark places, and there was a whole selection of miners' lamps. They were made of tin with a copper spout. A copper wire went down into the bowl to heat the oil. Now, these lamps were just stuck into the walls of the tunnel. Men also might use the same kind of a clamp with a candle holder on it. About 1905, George Knowles left the store and the post office that he was running in Bohemia City at the music mine, and he came to town and went into partnership with Gottfried, or maybe it was Fred Grabber, a man who came here from Switzerland to work in the mines. Knowles and Grabber opened a store in this here building to handle mining and logging supplies. You know the store is Pioneer Hardware Store today. There was other people supplying the mines too. One was the Bartels family. Now they came here from Kansas back in 1900 and got into the refrigeration, meat cutting, and mining businesses. Bartels opened a refrigeration plant in town and then a meat market that supplied the mines and the CCC camps. They'd make a little money in the market, then lease it and go mining. Bill is that young feller there in the picture. Oh, there's Bill again with his dad in the constable, Green Pitcher. Now, Pitcher served on the police force for some 32 years. Never used a gun to make an arrest. The kids loved that guy. See, that meat store kept the meat out in the open. Didn't even have windows, trying to keep the place colder. They sold and carried the meat to the mines. Why, once a week, Bill even skied in with the meat in the winter. Another time, they even flew in the meat with an airplane from Eugene when mine supplies got low. Boy, did that story make the papers. Even got on the news in Hollywood. Now, here's a picture of Main Street back in 1911. That fancy brick building there had to be taken out when the Pacific Highway came through town. No paving yet either, still a horse and buggy wagon. Along about 1900, a mining friend and builder, George Lee, had the contract for putting gravel in wooden gutters here in town. He hauled rock from the Spray Rock Company, where Zumwalt and Williams is today. Old Doc Oglesby, a fancy-dressed miner and doctor, decided to assay that gravel, and he found gold in it, sure enough. Wasn't enough to pay, however, at $20 an ounce, so they just let it go. Isn't that something? Streets paved with gold right here in Cottage Grove. They told that story in Ripley's Believe It or Not. That train there was the center of activity. Everyone came to the depot to see what was happening. When people on the east side of the river finally stopped calling the place Lematai in 1901, the depot could hang up one sign instead of 3, including Slabtown, the old name for the west part of Cottage Grove. The name came from the wood slabs that were thrown in the muddy streets in the wintertime. The Bohemia mines were responsible for getting the first short-line railroad in this town. They had to get that ore to the smelter in Tacoma, Washington. Saginaw was competing to get the depot, but the Cottage Grove government and the mill owner gave free land, and the Oregon Securities Mining Company put up the money. And the Oregon and Southeastern Railroad was here by 1904. That old 440 Cook engine ran the line till it was wrecked back in 1941. This here's the number 9 engine at the depot in 1921. Every Sunday, folks would take the pleasure ride to Wildwood Falls and Red Bridge. On weekdays, the work trip to Diston took about 2 hours more or less. Now, this here train photo was taken near Diston back in 1908, when the train had to give up most of its passengers to that newfangled invention, the automobile. The Galloping Goose came into service for the local folks. It was made from an abandoned four-cylinder Buick engine and the body of an old streetcar. In 1919, 17,000 people rode that rickety old thing over the uneven rails up to the hills. Here's another crazy idea. They call it the speeder, a little handcar that could make a quick trip up to the mountains. Once you got up to Culp Creek on your way to the mines, you had to decide which way to go. You turned right at Red Bridge, which was a covered bridge painted with barn paint, and you headed up Sharps Creek over Staples Bridge to make your way to the Vesuvius Mine or Fairview Mountain. At Red Bridge, there was a boarding house, a two-story saloon, and the Bucket of Blood dance hall. You could keep following the Raw River to Diston and make your way up the Bryce's Creek or Brass Creek Trail. Those roads are at the top of the picture. The lower roads to the right go to Oakland and the North Umpqua. This here map shows you the mines and the rest places. On the lower Sharps Creek, there's the Mineral Hotel. On the old Noonday Trail at the top of the picture is the Ridge Hotel. All those X's are where the ruins of miners' cabins have been found. Well, those freight people had all sorts of inventions to get the goods up that mountain. That old egg crate made from bed springs is in your museum today. There are other items from the mines there, too. Now, all of those things had to fit in the back of pack saddles that held the weight real tight so the horses wouldn't complain too much. Miles Pitcher used this saddle to haul mail from his log cabin home and post office in Darena, or Star, as it used to be called. Now, if you were taking the trip up Bryce's Creek, you could stop for the night at Lund Park, which was a stage stop started by Harry Parker and Alex Lundberg, who came from Scandinavia to work these mines. The old name for Lund Park was warehouse, because freight wagons and even cars could be stored there in warehouse cabins. The miners could get food at Lund Park, too. Tom Medden there on the left and Harry Parker were standing in their gardens in 1912. At one point, they even had glass greenhouses. Parker ran the hotel and Lundberg took care of the barn for hay storage and the warehouses. There was even a two-story log store. Freight went up to the Champion Mine 2 or 3 times a week during good weather. Now, these here folks are getting ready to move out of Lund Park up the trail. At the left mark there is Jim Potts, then Bird Farrier, old Doc Oglesby, and Henry Johnson. The horses are loaded and ready to go. These folks are also in Lund Park in 1915 moving logs. Now, those power lines are from a powerhouse on the north side of Bryce's Creek, which was powered by water from a log dam built by the Oregon Securities Company about 1900. You folks can still see the traces of the ditch that carried that water to the powerhouse. Now, this here is an old picture of the Ridge Hotel, the stopping place for the trip up Dead Horse Hill on the Noonday Trail. There's nothing left of this place now. There is the old outhouse, though. Scattered through the trees around the hotel are old boots and some hand-sealed cans, another proof that a lot of people stayed here one time or another. Now, if you're going up Sharps Creek way, you could bear right at Red Bridge and go up to the Hawley or Painted Post Ranch at the end of the wagon road. Mineral had a large barn and a 2-story hotel, the resting place before you tackled hard-scrabble grade. That was a 6-mile steep hill road with loose gravel. It took 8 or more hours to go 6 miles to the music mine, and you needed 6 or 8 good strong horses, when the trip from Cottage Grove had only used 4. Now we're getting down to business. These here folks are on a pack train going across Devil's Canyon. That bridge is made of solid trees felled across the canyon with rough boards between the 2 sets of logs on each side. Now, these folks are having an easy time traveling up the road around 1895 when they were building this mine. But these poor fellers are having to walk their way to the mines. In 1900, the mines were paying up to $2 for a 10-hour day and board, and that was good pay in them days. Miners would come, work a few weeks, and then move on. Some, though, would stay and work through the winter when there was less water in the tunnels. Now, these men are packing all their gear. The one in the back is a wheelbarrow, but the one in the front pulls a rope attached to the wheelbarrow to help with the load. Miners came from all over, I'll tell you. These were Scandinavian fellas. Alex Lundberg is on the right there. There were Swiss, Germans, Irish, and Italians, and even Chinese who worked at the mines. Ed Knowles, the store owner at Bohemia City, could do business in 5 languages to accommodate the miners. Everyone was welcome, of course, but for a while, Oregon had a law that said the Chinese couldn't own property and had to pay a tax to be allowed to live here. Chinese earned 25 cents for a 10-hour day. They got rid of that law, though. The miners built pretty good places for themselves. The winter snow would get over 15 or maybe 20 feet deep in some places, so the walls had to be strong. This here picture of the crew at the old Vesuvius mine shows a cabin made of big old trees. That little feller on the stump is the assayer who had his own work cabin. This here picture shows the fancy things inside a miner's cabin. There were good lights and windows and even some fancy reading materials. Miners were not ignorant men. Mining took money and brains. Some miners had been engineers and teachers, even doctors and farmers, before the gold fever hit them. This fancy lamp was from A.P. Churchill's cabin in the Big Four claim. The miners took pretty good care of themselves, and some camps would even have some modern conveniences. This 1917 washing machine at your museum came from the Sweepstakes mine. They had all sorts of utensils and a cookhouse later on. That water can was handmade. Now, that lunch bucket had a cap on it that was the drinking cup. Julia Bartels, I think it was, cooked for 14 at that Star mine back around 1922. The miners had to provide for themselves in the winter, and this here building at the Champion mine shows just how strong their places were. They would get around on skis if they had to. Bill Bartels remembers going to work out the second-story window to get on top of the snow. This little feller is playing at the assayer's cabin at the lead crystal mine. The snow was all the way to the roof. Skis like Harry Parker's handmade ones of chickapin were used a lot of the mines. There's a good story about the feud that went on over the years between Joe Damewood, who once had the mail route up to the mines. When the snow was high, he used snowshoes and skis to make the deliveries to mailboxes nailed to the trees near the mines. Miners would move the mailboxes up or down the tree according to the snow level. Joe's contract said he had to personally deliver any parcel up to 50 pounds. Mr. Hard, who managed the Vesuvius mine, was always feuding with Joe, but the feud rested while he went south to California every winter. One winter, out of spite, he ordered a ton of coal packed in 50-pound sacks to be delivered parcel post to his cabin. Old Joe did it on snowshoes, but he kind of fussed a little, as you might imagine. Now, these are Bill Patton's snowshoes, or bear claws, as he calls them. An older brother, Leroy, was killed hauling mail up to the mines. He was going up Sharps Creek and was 3 miles away from Red Bridge when the team ran away and threw him out of the buckboard. Now, there was always something happening around those mines. One of the miners, Bill Patton, took over the Big Four claim that Churchill had. Bill loved to hunt, and he specialized in cougars, even made up cougar rugs. He took care of keeping the mines free of these critters, had a couple of fine hunting terriers that worked with him. He earned $50 for each hide in bounty money or warrants during the Depression. He started working the mines in Bohemia back in 1928 and had 7 cabins. He worked the claims called President, Twin Rocks, Tall Timber, Glenwood, Grabber, Hell Hole, and a bunch more. Well, now that we got you up to the mines, we ought to tell you a little bit more about how to mine. Now, this feller is doing some placer mining, as it's called. Now, that word is Spanish, and there's a reason for it. You see, not many Easterners knew anything about mining. When gold was found in California, miners came up from the old gold mines in South America. Remember, all of California belonged to Mexico till the 1840s. Now, these fellers knew how to mine, and so did the immigrants who came around Cape Horn from Germany, Wales, France, and Spain. So the Spanish gave this word to the type of mining that just uses water in a special pan. You swish that water round and round, tipping out the dirt and the big pieces. Since gold is 19 times heavier than water and 7 times heavier than most of the other metals it's found with, it stays in the pan after all the other stuff is gone. Now this feller is also using a sluice box, a wooden box with special cross pieces called riffles built into the bottom of the box to catch that gold as it sifts to the bottom when the water runs through the box. Now you can use placer mining or poor man's mining to figure out just where to make your claim. You can work your way up the side of the stream panning some samples as you go. When you don't find any more gold, you know the edge of the gold-bearing area. Now this only works where there are mountains old enough to have their sides washed down and worn away by years of weathering, and most of Bohemia hills are too young to have much placer gold. There were a few placer mines, though. They didn't have much of the tunnel shown in these side views of the claims. Up at Glenwood and Sailor's Gulch and Hardscrabble Grade were a few placer mines and also a hydraulic mine. Now, hydraulic mining really tore up the hills. You'd use a high-power hose to just squirt the mountains to bits and direct that muddy water into sluice boxes that caught the gold. That hillside in Glenwood is bare from trees being cut to open up space for the hydraulic setup. Well, they don't do that anymore. Got too much respect for the land, and there's just too many new laws. That gold that Oglesby, Adams, and Shields found in 1858 was free placer gold at Sailor's Gulch. The heavy gold had fallen between the rocks in the stream bed. O.P. Adams and another feller personally walked the 200 miles to the big gold camp in Jacksonville to learn how to make sluice boxes to trap the gold. That feller Johnson found the first gold quartz in 1863. The ore that needed to be crushed to get out the gold. The quartz had to be mined out of the ground from tunnels. When you finally did figure out just where the vein of gold or ore was located, and you filed your claim at the nearest recorder's office, you then had to build the tunnel. Your surface mining claim gave you the right to use the timber on the claim to build equipment for your mine as long as you did $100 worth of work each year. You could not sell the timber, however. At first, all you had was a whipsaw to make the timbers you needed to brace up the ground around the entrance to the tunnel. If you found good ore, you then could apply for a patented claim from the government. If the government said yes, you actually bought the land outright and you paid property tax on it. Even in them days, it was your private property. These fellers are building the tunnel to the Noonday Mine. See how thick those timber braces are? Later on, you might be lucky enough to rig up a portable sawmill like this one that Ray Nelson owned. For the most part, though, you depended on oxen to haul the wood and manpower to cut them trees. Men skilled at using a broadaxe could shape them timbers. These oxen are hauling the logs to build the Noonday. Once you got that entryway done, you were ready to start the hard rock mining. Some days you were lucky and got ahead a few feet. Other days you were lucky to make 1 foot through the different kinds of rock in those tunnels. Young fellers got jobs mucking or shoveling out the rock from the path of those miners. That's how Bill Bartell started in the mines, and he was only 12 years old. Now these here fellas are using the double jacking method of drilling holes for the blasting powder. One hand holds the steel while the other hits it with a hammer. This feller is using single jacking. Dynamite didn't need such a large hole, so only one man could do the job. During the winter months, the men used to keep that dynamite right around the tops of their boots to keep it from freezing. One of the most important men in the camp was that blacksmith. Now he cared for the shoes of the animals, made simple equipment, and kept those jacking tools sharp. He didn't have much tools to work with himself. Your museum has some of those tools. This here forge was loaned to the museum by Reason Longfellow. I hear there is still a blacksmith set up there at Cripple Creek. These bellows also came from the mines. Once you got into the tunnels, you needed special hats to light the way. That light in the back is a poacher light from the mines, and there's a miner's candle in front. Once big machinery came up to the mines, all sorts of fancy ideas were tried out. This air tank was used for the big compressor drills. The drills got pretty fancy, too. The Bartons were using these tools back in the 1950s. Now, once you found the ore, you had to have the assayer tell you if there was enough gold per ton to pay the shipping charges all the way to the smelter in Tacoma and have any left over to pay your bills. Gold was worth around $20 an ounce, and you were lucky to get more than 2 ounces of gold from 1 ton of ore. And even if you found a vein of good ore, the vein was not the same size or worth all the way through. During the 1930s, it needed to make about $35 or $40 a ton just to make the whole operation pay. Some people made the mistake of building fancy equipment in a place before they could completely check out the vein. They went broke pretty fast, I'll tell you. Some people mined a combination of high-grade and low-grade ore just to keep that mine paying for a longer period of time. This here's the assayer's cabin, still standing at the lead crystal mine. People still working at that place. Now these here are some of the assayer's tools at your museum. That mortar and pestle for grinding the ore is pretty heavy. Quintin Barton, as I recall, can remember following his dad up and down the mountainside day after day when he was only about 12 years old. He had to carry a 25-pound mortar and the water for penning. He wasn't allowed to drink that water, no sirree. His father had prospected in desert country, and he didn't see any need for carrying extra. They'd drink at a stream when they found one. Now, this crazy thing at the museum is part of a water turbine that powered an Arrastra mine. Now, that idea was another mining tool the Spanish brought us from the old country. Most times a mule or ox would walk around the Arrastra in a circle, pulling a pole that was hitched to 2 big rocks that ground round and round, crushing that ore, sort of like an old grinding mill. Lots of gold was lost in this process, but it was a cheap way to get the gold. There was an Arrastra mine up Walker Creek, as I recall, and the Arrastra was 32 feet across, according to Ray Nelson anyway. A ditch carried water from falls on Sharps Creek, where a little dam was built to direct that water. The flume carried the water through the penstock, which turned the gears that dragged the rocks around in a round pan lined with stones. No parts of that mill are around these days, but this was the turbine. One mine even had a Chilean mill, which was an Arrastra with heavy stones. Now, this fancy setup is a stamp mill. This kind of machine came over from the Georgia-Carolina gold rush back in the 1820s and was changed in the California gold fields, where the wooden parts were made of cast iron to last longer and stamped that ore cheaper. Then it came up here to Oregon. The ore was dumped into the battery or crushing box under the rods, which worked on a series of pistons moving at different times. Water moved the crushed pieces out onto that flat copper plate that was coated with mercury that was being mined in London and Sutherland. Now, this gold stuck to the mercury while the rest of the waste floated into the water on down to the special wooden trays that caught more of the pieces. The waste was then dumped at the mine. Back in 1867, Bird Ferrier made the first mining property sale of the district when he sold his Excelsior claim to Levi Knott. Knott put up a 5-stamp mill, this one in the picture, by taking the mill up by oxen up a trail he widened along the divide between Sharps and Bryce's creeks. The stamp mill, steam engine, and boiler were shipped from San Francisco to Portland by ocean freighter, then traveled by riverboat down to Eugene. That mill was pulled up the Knott Trail by 16 oxen in 1877. Knott made $4,700 the first year and $1,000 the next. Water was scarce, legal problems happened, and the mill closed down. Your own Prospectors Club hauled this mill down to the museum. This feller is Cy Bingham doing the cleanup at the Music Mine Stamp Mill in Bohemia City in 1896. Those softballs or biscuits of gold and mercury were rolled off the copper sheets. Then the ball was put in a chamois bag and the mercury wrung out of it. There was still some mercury left, so the remaining stuff was heated and the mercury steamed off and the gold was concentrated. Then the concentrates were shipped down to the smelter. One miner carried a 50-pound gold brick to town. Other bricks would be left for Mr. Finnerty, the train man, to get to town. Now these are some concentrates from a stamp mill. They assayed out to 25 ounces of gold per ton, not really enough to bother with when the gold price was fixed by the government at $20 an ounce. Mining was needing more and more big money, so people got together and formed mining companies. The sale of shares would raise enough to purchase machinery and pay the wages till money was paid back from ore shipped to Tacoma. A.P. Churchill and some of his partners made this prospectus to convince people to buy shares in his Big Four mining claim. By this date, though, mining had come into a little depression. Yes, sir. Big investors from all over the country and even England had been putting a lot of money into western mines. In 1906, though, the biggest investing outfit in New York City found out that it had bought shares in a mine that was phony and running no gold at all. The company closed its doors and member banks had to close theirs because they had no more money. Folks called it the panic of '06 and '07. Oregon mining stock was going down. Churchill kept trying to raise money, though, and formed more companies to interest his friends back east. He made a decent living at the mines and remained a gentleman. Your museum has a whole collection of these fancy mining certificates. None of them worth much nowadays. People kept trying to find gold in those mines. This company tried to get working around 1914. There's a whole lot of untruth in this little book, with the director claiming they would even build their own smelter to save on shipping costs. That flotation mill he writes about was a new process that tried to break down the sulfide ores that would not work with the stamp mill with mercury plates. Different chemicals were added to oil and the concentrates were poured in. Then the waste metals would float for easy removal. It revolutionized mining for the sulfide ores that had been a problem in this district. The change was not enough, though, to give mining a boom again. Timber was picking up the economy around these parts after the bad mining days. Now let's take a look at some of the big mines in the district. This here is a picture of the Zinnikers who came with the grabbers from Switzerland. They bought the Vesuvius claim on Fairview Mountain and just went to work. They worked all over that hill. In 1902, they fired a round in the tunnel at the end of the day and let the fumes clear overnight. When they came back the next morning, they saw the end of the tunnel just shining with gold. Boy, some of that gold ran $29,000 to the ton. Frank Hard, a mining man from Colorado country, really wanted the mine and made the men a good offer, which they took. Fred Grabber used his cash to start his store in town. Hard built this cabin across the road for his family and founded the Vesuvius Mines Company. By 1908, he had a 10-stamp mill there and an 1,800-foot tramway that connected with the mine and the mill. By 1921, there were 7,000 feet of tunnels and other workings. In 1920, Frank Hard and his son Charles died and the mining stopped. Snow and thieves destroyed the buildings and the main building burned to the ground. Ray Nelson bought the mine in recent years and built this cabin from the remaining boards around the mine site, mostly from the bunkhouse. That's his old Model A, you see there. This is what that cabin looks like today as you're going up to Fairview. Now, if you take a right turn at Vesuvius, you'll cross Bohemia Saddle over the ruins of Bohemia City. It looked like this in 1863. In 1866, a group of miners decided to establish a town called Bohemia City near the open meadows where they had pastured their horses. They drew up a code of laws and set up the size of the district. Those laws also set up the legal size of claims and got the rights to the water for the townspeople. By 1868, over 100 men lived there. That city didn't last long, however, and was deserted by 1891. That's when Jim Music came up from California looking for mining land. He mined in California, Arizona, and Oregon. He got tired of inspecting the old Bohemia City, so he leaned over a nearby stream for a drink, and then he saw it. A big, beautiful nugget right there in the stream. Cottage Grove put out a special edition of the papers just to tell his story. By 1892, he had a 5-stamp mill, an engine, a boiler, tools, and provisions up at the mine site, and Bohemia City was booming again. In 9 days, the mill ran $4,000. In 3 years, they earned $35,000. By 1897, the traffic needed a new route, so the Red Bridge was built and a new wagon road made to carry that traffic. In 1898, his company built Hardscrabble Road. Miners donated labor, and the county gave $700. They didn't use fancy ideas, no siree. 40 or 50 men would pick up a felled tree and just toss it over the edge of the road. If you go there today, you'll see the old Lundberg Stagehouse, which is part of the county park area. Another building at the music mine is the Knowles and Geddes store. George Knowles brought his family over from Mapleton in 1903 to join his friend Charlie Geddes at Bohemia. Now, Knowles was reliable, so he hired out as a packer for the mines, trusting with carrying the mill concentrates out for the smelter and then bringing supplies back. Mrs. Knowles worked in the cookhouse. In 1904, he opened his store. In 1905, he became the postmaster and the deputy mineral recorder who legally files the mining claims. The family moved to the upstairs rooms in the store. The Knowles store had everything a person ever could need. Their orders for supplies went all over the state. They even had a little extra for celebrating once in a while. That old store is still standing in the park. You can see it just past the oil tank with the funny top roof. The Prospectors Club restored that place, but vandals wrecked it again. On the right side of the ore car tracks out of the Music Mine Tunnel, a group of Hodad tree-planting people bought that mine, and they've even planted trees around the place. Give part of the land for the park, they did. Those old boards in the track, well, they're from the snow roof that covered the track for the winter. That road down in front of the store is the tramway, a special road that was flat enough to take the ore carts all the way to the Big Champion mine. Still is a pretty place up there. Now these here fellers are on that flat road before the track was laid. On the left there is George Lang, who came here from Ireland when he was only 19 years old. George and Carrie moved to a place at Regata and raised cattle to supply the miners for some 6 years. Then they moved closer to town. They took the meat up by wagon. Dave Mosby, the center person there in the picture, was the son of Dave Mosby, who settled on Mosby Creek in 1852 on a donation land claim. Well, by 1906, this 6,000-foot tramway was finished from the Music to the Champion mine, and in 1903, the Oregon Securities Company from New Jersey had bought up the Helena, Champion, and Music mines and had control. Construction of the Oregon and Southeastern Short Line Railroad from town began. Now, this company set out to do mining in a big way that would make it pay. Here two teachers from town. They're, I think, Myrtle Purvance and Robert Rose. They're on a Sunday outing back in 1915. Well, before the electricity got all hooked up, Hugh Doolittle was using this old-fashioned horsepower to move these wooden ore carts to the mill. The ore moved along right fast, it did. You can ride along this tramway road today, but the tracks are gone, stolen mostly. This here is the first building called the Champion that was started back in 1895 on the old Knott's Trail and owned by the Hartford Company of Chicago. There was a 10-stamp mill here. This building is gone now, but you can see the old foundation if you look close. Then things really got to happening, and this town never was the same. Pat Jennings sold his interest in the Champion to the Oregon Securities Company in 1903. The company moved over the 10 stamps from the music mill, the 10 stamps from the Helena mine, and put them in one big building with the 10 stamps from the old Champion. This huge mill and the planned electric railway from Lund Park were run with the power from the old power plant in Lund Park. Took 7 miles of power line, it did. Now, this fancy place even had its own government post office. They called it Orseco. Electrical Superintendent Andy Nelson, he was Ray's father, put in the electrical equipment to run that covered ore tramway that came some 3,000 feet down the hill from the big number 9 tunnel. It was covered with a snow roof, too. Bill Bartell says that slope made a good ski run in the wintertime. Some miners didn't even bother with the skis. They just cut off a small fir tree trunk and trimmed it, put it between their legs for a break, and took off down the hill. Oh, that was some ride. This here's a picture of the mill in 1908, when Blaine Whipple was putting in the phone wires for the 15 phones up there. In 1905, high-grade ore was hit at the Champion. It ran $30,000 to the ton. Joe Landis says it shined like a jewelry store up there. Only certain men were let in the mine. They put canvas on the floor and brushed the gold from the walls. Bigger pieces were put in double sacks and carried out. I hear some miners still managed to hide some gold dust in their tobacco pouches and pipes. There was dancing in the streets back in town. The company couldn't keep operating with the inflation in later years, though, and during the Depression, so work really slowed down. The Bartell's family has owned and worked the Champion and nearby claims now for years. There's 25,000 feet of tunnel in that Champion mine. One of these fellers, Charlie Bruno, found a big Helena strike near the Annie Trail in 1896. He was a photographer from town that tired of that work and came to the mines. He and the Jennings brothers worked the mine and found a rich streak that ran up to $30,000 a ton. Those gold rocks were shown in the store windows in town. A saloon was named the Helena. The ore went over $300 for many months. The men sold out to the Oregon securities people when they got to the ores that needed better machines. Now this here is the Helena bunkhouse. In 1936, there were 17 men working 3 shifts round the clock, 7 days a week. Mrs. Reeves did the cooking on a stove that's still up there, and a hired man did the laundry. She made 8 loaves of bread a day and 4 pies. That's Quintin Barton bringing up supplies in his old Model A. That car took a beating on those trails, but it ran for years. The Bartons worked on the mines in the late 30s when the Depression brought mining costs low enough to make it pay again. That bunkhouse is still standing with that cable all around it to hold it up against the snow. Sure looks pretty. The Helena, like the other mines, ran until World War II when the government outlawed supplies to the gold mines, so the gold miners would be forced to work in mining metals needed for the war. These mines had those metals too, but the government still said no. Mining never did pick up again. Miners still grumble about that. One year, folks from all over the world came from the university in Corvallis to see this old place. Now this here is all that's left of the main tunnel today, with that last load of ore still ready for shipment years ago. The Bartons still own it, but it's not worth much. This equipment is a little run down, as you can see. That tunnel is still mighty chilly. Best place to work in the summertime. In the winter, the cool air comes down from the tunnel above this one, and it's right warm when the air gets to here. Heating and air conditioning all in the same place. These tired animals are bringing up the huge boilers from Indianapolis for the big noonday operation in the 1890s when folks from Chicago brought it up. The animals hauled up a 20-stamp mill, 8 concentrators, the 2 boilers, and a 60-horsepower high-speed engine. All fancy equipment for handling oxidized ores. The only trouble was that a few feet into the tunnels, the ores changed to sulfide ores. None of that there machining was worth a hoot. That mill ran for 2 weeks in September of 1899, collected $50,000 and shut down. Never to run again. Those fellers didn't do their prospecting or assaying homework first, I figure. Here's the same boilers those animals were hauling. Now that place is just a waste. Here's some scouts are looking it over. Today, here's all that's left of that fancy idea. Now, we had a few characters in those hills, I'll tell you. This feller, Bohemia Smitty, was one of them. He was an electrical engineer in New York for about 11 years before he came here to run his 2-stamp mill at his Twin Rocks claim on Fairview Mountain. He was a genius with those machines, but old Demon Rum could make a fool out of him. One night, he tried to walk from Lund Park to the Champion Mines with his jug of whiskey. He stepped off the edge of that cliff and he fell. Boy, I tell you, when the men found him, he was hanging onto a tree, singing real loud and having a grand old time. So if you see Bohemia Smith Falls on the map, don't look for waterfalls around there, just an old tree. Here he is again, checking out ore with Al Churchill. Smitty could fix all the mine and generator equipment and do some fine mining himself when he left the whiskey jug alone. Bill Patton bought his Twin Rocks mill, lost it all in the snowslide. Here's a fancy picture of Doc Oglesby and his daughter Cynthia Ann, or Annie as she was called. He always looked fancy. He really was a medical doctor in town, but when a patient gave him some good mining news, off he'd go to the mines. I'm not sure if this is Doc or maybe Professor Day. Day was an accountant and bookkeeping teacher that came up from Coos Bay to the mines. Always dressed real fancy, he did. His cabin is still up there. This here is Doc again with J.W. Kern from town at the Washerwoman Tunnel showing off their ore. In 1890, he struck it rich near the old Knott Mine, called it the Annie Mine. He made $10,000 in one summer and $16,500, I think it was, the next year. This here is a picture of the boarding house at the Annie Mine. Mrs. Bales there is the woman in the center. Jim Potts is right next to her there. The lower branches on that tree mark the snow level where the upper branches were cut for firewood. Now here's some fellers at the Bohemia Girl Tunnel. I believe that tunnel's still working. Another old character was Bohemia Sharp. He was a civil engineer who came here about 1864 from Illinois. He resigned as Cottage Grove postmaster to build a mine of his own. This here is the 1904 issue of the Bohemia Nugget that told of the first meeting of the Bohemia Mine Owners Association. Why, you know that club is still meeting every month in town. There's A.P. Churchill, secretary, in his suit with a fancy tie. That picture under him is Ed Jenks. Jenks and Johnny Grabber were best of friends. These fellas were pretty smart. By 1908, they were pushing to have a separate county started up so they wouldn't have to go to Roseburg or Eugene to do their land business. They were going to call it Bohemia, but changed it to Nesmith in honor of Colonel Nesmith, pioneer senator from Oregon. In 1909, a Nesmith rally was in the streets of town. The bill was voted down in Salem, however, and the mine owners returned to their work. Since the Lane Douglas County line ran plumb through the mines, some legal business went to Roseburg. All those miners made the trip in 1907 to be witnesses in a lawsuit involving Pat Jennings and others. You needed witnesses to prove your claim boundaries and the amount of work you'd done. All the fellers I've talked about are here in their fancy duds at the county courthouse. Now we got to bring that gold or money back to town and spend it. Now these here folks were Herbert Eakin and Darwin Bristow at the first general store in the Wilbur building on River Road in 1890. They took a lot of gold dust as payment and for storage in their burglar-proof safe. They even hid money everywhere, sugar barrels, coffee barrels, and even under the vegetables. In 1894, their business was just too big for the little store, so they moved to the fanciest business block in town and added a fireproof vault. They stayed here till about 1904. When Polk Curran's drugstore was torn down, the bricks were used to build a second floor in this building. This town sure had some fine buildings that were torn down. These here bills in A.P. Churchill's 1904 ledger show that they traded regularly with people from the mines. Yes, sir, that store was important to this here town. That there Masonic Hall is really your first bank in town, Eakin and Bristow's First National Bank. That place is worth saving, don't you think? Your town was really growing, paved streets and all. It still had the stage line to the mines, though. That Bartell Hotel was new, and business was just a-booming with the new lumber mills. Cottage Grove always had plenty of saloons to help the miners. There were the old Bohemia and Helena saloons around 1890 between 6th and 7th Streets when it was still pasture on the east side of the river. Well, at least the folks had the decency to put all the saloons, more than 13 at one time, I figure, on the north side of the street, so us decent folks could walk on the south side. When the fights got too bad, the drunken miners would leave the Lemati town and the sheriff and just hightail it over the bridge to Slabtown or West Cottage Grove, where the law-abiding folks lived. Lemati was an Indian word for peaceful valley, but there weren't much peace when some of those miners came to town, I'll tell you. You still have your old Helena Saloon, you know. Sort of changed its style, but it's still here. Why, in 1959, as part of the Oregon Centennial, they had the first Bohemia Day celebration and made this here building back into the old saloon, minus the alcohol, of course. Pretended to hang a man there every night. The Catholic Church folks put on the whole shebang. Julia Bartels traveled all the way to that history office in Portland to see old pictures so they could fix up the inside the way it used to be. Boy, I tell you, that was the best party this town has seen in many a day. We've had Bohemia Mining Days ever since. The lady in the fancy long dress is Evelyn Pleward, next to her husband, Lloyd. She painted a fancy lady picture to hang over the bar. Bill Bartels was tending bar, and he'd sell a glass of root beer for a nickel to any kid who could put his foot on the brass rail. Every night they had a fine show here, complete with can-can dancers. Charlie LaFollette, the high school music teacher, played the piano and wrote a new song every night. You still have places in town connected to the mines. This here is the roundhouse that Joe Landis, superintendent at the Champion Mines, he built that around 1925. Two steel bands hold the frame together. He said, "I figured I'd have a house no woman could corner me in." I tell you, that house was in Ripley's, believe it or not. A while back, the new owners moved it from Main Street to a new place, and they called it the Round To It Gift Shop. George Lee made some money at the mines and came back to town to do some fine carpentering. He built this here house for Lucy and the children in 1891 on the future side of Highway 99. The fireplace had pipes for heating and fresh air. The smallest room was 14 feet by 18 foot. It was moved back when the road came through. This was the first office of the fancy Village Green lodging place. The old house has its original woodwork. Lee did the finishing work on many old houses here in town. The U.S. Bank had its beginnings in the old Bartels meat market place that got fancier. The rocks in the new building came from the Music Mine area, and there's said to be some gold shining in them. Around 1970, the gold was worth about $100. These days, with no government price on gold, it's anybody's guess. This ad on the side of the old Nelson Electric building across the Riverview Terrace tells the business that Ray Nelson had when he wasn't up at the mines. It was also on the side of one of them fancy houses. There might have been a skating rink there once, too. Those Nelson boys always did work with electricity. The first electric light plant in Cottage Grove was built by Andy Nelson, Ray's dad, with money he'd made as an engineer at the Annie mine. In 1894, the lights went on in town. The water wheel ran the mill during the day, and the electric light generator at the flour mill ran from dusk to 10 p.m. Nelson built a bigger plant that burned down to the ground about 1900. G.H. Stone, who owned a flour mill, agreed to provide the building and water for a turbine water wheel, and the lights went on again. The water power came from this here water supply. In 1935, Andy Nelson made this working model of a 5-stamp mill. It's still sitting in your museum. This picture of Ray Nelson is from that Eugene paper in about 1976. Ray always loved to talk about the mines. There were people who did a lot more mining up there, but Ray did the most work on figuring out the history of the mines and telling other folks about the fine heritage they had in those hills. He even wrote a little book about the mines before he died in 1978. This whole picture show was his idea. We sort of went ahead and did it in his memory. Sure to miss hearing his stories. Ray lived with his wife, Jen, and their children in the house on River Road called the Stone House. At one time, Annie Oglesby Graham lived there, too. That house was built in 1894 by Glenn H. Stone, the flour mill owner, and his wife, Carrie, who designed it. She had lumber shipped from her home state, Tennessee. The fancy woodwork is made from chippequin, yew wood, maple, oak, and redwood. Ray's family lived there for years. Mrs. Nelson helped with this here story. Now, this is part of the sign in your museum that was hand-painted by William F. Berg, one of the early assayers in this town. He remembered painting this sign and was glad to see it had been saved. It's hid behind some shelves, but you can find it pretty easy. The Berg family lived in this here place everybody calls the McFarland House on North River Road because the McFarlands staked out their donation land claim in this area. They'd divided up their land for lots that are now your downtown area. The J.I. Jones house over there on I Street was built in 1893 and was owned by J.I. Jones, a merchant, then by Jennings of the mining folks, Mr. Bruno, Mr. Bristow, and then J. Frank McFarland. It was built on the old McFarland land claim. Frank and Elizabeth had a maternity home there for years, and over 1,000 babies were born in this house, cared for by old Uncle Mac. Around 1900, Frank was construction foreman for $5 a day on the first 10 miles of railroad out to Bohemia. He was a logging the right-of-way when a miner named Jennings gave him a sack of gold bricks worth $32,000 and asked him to deposit it in town when he went back on the handcar. Pat Jennings asked that favor several times, and Frank hauled over $37,000 more in gold for them. Frank died in 1969. These are the Jennings brothers. This here house belonged to Dr. George Snap, who built it in 1886 on land from the Hazelton donation land claim. It was built on the place where Riverview Terrace is now. That was where Doc had his office and his home. Called himself a doctor, a surgeon and dentist. Mrs. Ray Nelson and a friend owned it once and had a little gift shop there called the Storybook House. It was almost torn down in 1966 for the apartments, but the Bohemia Mining Days Committee bought it and moved it to this place. It's always open during Bohemia Days. Right behind the house is cleared land that their Prospectors Club is fixing up real nice for a park. Those people in the club aren't all miners, just folks interested in helping to improve the community. Now, if you want to find out more about the mines, there's a few places to go. The Oregon Historical Society up in Portland can help you, and the University in Eugene has that old Diller book and the Senator Bourne letters. Your own library has a whole pile of books on mining. You see, when the miner Ed Jenks died, he left money to the library to buy mining books. The best book there is Golden Was the Past, written by a group of Cottage Grove history writers. Couldn't have told this story without that book and Ray Nelson's book called Facts and Yarns of the Bohemia, Oregon Gold Mines. Another fine place is that Cottage Grove Museum on Birch Street. They might have Ray's book for sale. That building used to be a Catholic church, built in 1897 on the McFarland land claim. The windows there are gifts from some people connected with the mines. The Bartells helped work out the purchase of the place for a museum in 1966 when the church moved to a bigger place. Here's another friend who helped with the story, Mrs. Donna Allen. For years, she was sort of a mother hen to the place. This is one of them fancy windows that the Jennings family brought from the mines to give to the church. That stained glass came from Italy. Another place that has a lot of history in it is this cemetery out towards Lorain. There's where you find a lot of miners and their families. There's Johnny Grabber's grave near his brother Fred and his pal Ed Jenks. And there's one of them fellers that followed the whole story of the mines, Doc Oglesby. He lived over on Birch Street after he stopped mining. Now here's some fine folks who helped make this show back in 1979. There's Cougar Bill Patton and his wife Elsie. His dad Jasper settled in Mosby Creek in 1887. Bill and Elsie owned the Dorena store nearly 10 years. Bill had a machine shop up there for nearly 20. Elsie was a cook at the mines way back, and Bill worked there too. They're really helpful folks. Now here's Bill and Julia Bartells, all gussied up in their fancy duds from the 1959 centennial when Bill tended bar in the Helena Saloon and Julia auditioned the entertainment. Bill's holding that fancy gold-tipped cane made from cow horns by Rattlesnake Bob Veach. Those folks had plenty of pictures and stories to tell, and they were sure fine people to work with. Well, I guess it's time to be getting back to the mines. Figure I'll ride that old goose train up to Culp Creek and ride with a pack train from there. Yeah, can't stay in town much longer. Hear there's a new strike on the claim next to mine. Come on up and visit the mines. Get yourself a map from the museum, the Chamber of Commerce, or the Forest Service office. The mines are a real fine place to visit. Remember to stay off the patented claims that are private property, of course, and stay away from timbers and tunnels that just don't look safe. Well, here's the rest of my partners. Bob Schaefer, who used to own Heritage Studio, did a lot of fine photo work. Quintin Barton did the artwork. Karen Pepper did the studying and put the story together and did some of the photos, too. The Bohemia Mining Days Committee paid the bills, and me, I just call me the old prospector, Don James. Well, hope you enjoyed the show. We enjoyed putting it together for you. Time to go now. Take care of those mines now and enjoy that Mining Days celebration. I'll be seeing you.